Thank you, Teeny. I know I'm home in California when someone introduces my work as kick-ass. I just happen in New Jersey. Thank you. It is just great to be here today. I grew up in California, not very far from here, in a little town called Fremont, that a very long time ago used to have a movie studio called SNA Films, where this guy would make movies. So I spent an awful lot of time as a kid watching silent movies, and I'm still mesmerized by them, how much information can be conveyed from the actions of the human body. And that's essentially what I'm going to talk about today. The talk can be cut up into two pieces, a very short beginning piece, and then a longer follow-up piece. The very short beginning piece is the question, does our visual system treat moving people any differently than it treats moving objects? I'll get to why later. That's going to be the second part. So if the visual system is going to treat moving people and moving objects differently, and the question is, where would that happen? And so I started at the beginning. You've got the retina. We have this illusion of our visual world as being homogeneously smooth and high resolution, and yet actually our understanding of the world comes from what these little receptive fields can tell us. So it's like looking at the world through these lots and lots of little lenses. And what that means is to perceive realistic motion, you've got to combine information across space and across time. So I started out by looking at this question of whether our visual system treats moving people and moving objects any differently by looking at the question of whether the way information is combined over space and time differs if you're looking at people and looking at objects. And a really simple place to start with that is apparent motion, right? This illusion that we have every time we look at our computers or go to the cinema of static displays being presented in rapid alternation, giving rise to the perception of movement. So you all know if you showed these pictures one after the other in quick succession, you'd see a moving dot rather than two stationary dots. One of the things that fascinates me about the visual system is how much of our visual reality we have to construct, and apparent motion is a great example of that. So we know there's a point here and we know there's some other point over there, but we have no idea of knowing how the point got from one side to the other. Did it hit the ceiling? Did it roll on the ground? Who knows what it did? There's no way to know, right? Because there's an infinite number of points, paths that connect any 2 points. But for a long time, we've known that by and large, what our visual system defaults to solve this problem is just, let's assume that it's the shortest path of motion. And if you ever spend time watching old-fashioned Westerns, sometimes you see what's known as the wagon wheel illusion. The wagon wheels actually look like they're moving backwards. And that's a function of the shortest path constraint. Even though you know that the wheel has to be moving this way in order for the wagon to be going that way, because of the timing issue between when the images are taken and when, how fast the wheel's going, it could be that the two spokes that are closest together suggest that a motion's going backwards. So there are a lot of cases where we see the shortest path of apparent motion, even though we know it's wrong. Now the shortest path constraint is a lovely constraint, and it works under many, many conditions. But one of the things it assumes is that the paths of movement that we see, the extrapolations that we fulfill, are straight lines, they're rectilinear. And the problem with that is, if you're interested in the perception of the human body, is that our bodies follow curvilinear trajectories, not rectilinear ones, right? So many years ago, actually this is when I was a graduate student at Stanford, so a long time ago, Jennifer Fried and I looked at this question of, if you show pictures of the human body in apparent motion, do you see the shortest path? And in these two poses, that really was a long time ago. You see these two poses, right? The shortest path would be that one, right? Yeah. Would be nasty. And the long path is what I can do. So what do we see? Do we see the path of motion that humans can actually follow, or the shortest path constraint, or the shortest path? And here's a very simple illustration. So this is kind of hard to see, but it's two pictures like this, and I'm hoping most of the time what you see is a hand going in front of the body. So you're seeing paths of motion that are possible for a person to do. But if I show the same pictures with different timing, I got to go back for rotator cuff surgery. It's really clear. So it is possible to see things that are physically, impossible. Just because we're looking at a human body doesn't mean that we're perceiving it accurately, in this case. But it is also possible to see paths of apparent motion that don't follow this shortest path constraint. And this is just a cartoon of some data collected. So if this is the amount of how quickly we're showing the pictures, right? This is if it's going very quickly, and this is if it's rather slow. When we showed pictures of objects, folks pretty much always saw the shortest path constraint. They also saw the shortest path when we showed pictures of people under these high speed conditions. But when we showed people at timing rates that are consistent with the ways in which people actually move, then we got violations of this shortest path constraint. So a little bit of evidence to suggest that maybe the visual system is doing something different when it's looking at people and objects. Another way we've approached that question is a little more spatial than temporal, although it's impossible to decouple them. And that's something called the aperture problem. So each of these little receptive fields or lenses is an aperture. It can only see a piece of the world. And when a receptor has to look at the movement of an object, say if this is a receptor, say this long line, if the movement of an object that's larger than the receptive field, then this funny thing happens called the aperture problem. And the funny thing is, if what happens within the receptive field is just a straight line, there's no endpoints or corners or texture, low spatial frequency texture, then what happens is you can't measure the motion along the length of the line. You can only measure the motion that's perpendicular to the line. So what that means is there's a lot of illusions. You probably know the most famous one. It's called the barber pole illusion. Those old striped poles that you might see outside of old barber. Okay, so the motion is literally this way, but because of the aperture problem and because of the shape of the barber pole, you have this illusion of motion going this way. All that to say is there's a lot of ambiguity in local motion measurements. So what that means is, if you look at objects moving behind a bunch of apertures, it's not clear what's there. So this is an object that you see all the time, and if I ask you to tell me what that is, you'd have trouble telling me. Here's another one you use pretty frequently, and it's kind of hard, just looks like some moving line segments. It's hard to tell what that is. But that, everybody looks at that and says, oh, it's a person walking. We had a subject describe that as RuPaul. That was before the Drag Race show, but still. There's our ability to deal with noise, to integrate motion over space and time, can differ when you're looking at people moving and when you're looking at objects moving. It's not always the case. This case actually has some data. The rest are just guesses on my part. Susan Fisk did some really great work at Princeton, brain imaging work. We now know that there's a area in the brain, the superior temporal sulcus, that's really active when you look at moving people. But at least if you're a Princeton undergraduate looking at pictures of different kinds of people, then how much that area is active depends on what social category the person falls into. So if you have undergraduates from Princeton looking at pictures of affluent people, there's a lot of activity in the superior temporal sulcus. And if you have them looking at pictures of homeless people, there isn't. Interesting ways of thinking about objectification of other people. The military did a ton of research after World War II when they found out that most of the bullets shot in World War II were not actually shot at people. Who wants to shoot another person, right? They were shooting over the heads of the enemy soldiers. So a lot of research has gone into what do you need to do to get young recruits to objectify other people so you can shoot at them or beat them or perform surgery on them. There's amazing research done on shame and empathy. It turns out if you measure empathetic responses to pain, the group that shows the least empathy, surgeons. Which makes sense, right? Because how could you, if you were feeling a lot of empathy for someone, how could you possibly cut into them? Thomas Jefferson's farm book, I think, is one of the most ironic and cruel examples. A listing of farm implements and people as if they're equally valued, equally objectified. So it's not, I don't think it's always the case that the human visual system is going to analyze human movement differently from object movement, but it is often the case. And if it is often the case, then the question becomes why? Feel free to ask questions during the talk. We've looked at 3 reasons. Yes, please.
Just a real quick one.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there was effects of, depending on the social class that the person observed, you noticed different amounts of activation in the STS. So my question is, did you guys do any cross-cultural studies of this to see if, for instance, other countries have the same sort of reaction to, varying social class? So I was talking with Timo earlier that, at least in America, we seem to have a coping mechanism when it comes to homeless people to ignore. Yeah. Whereas other countries, go out of their way to deal with such situations. So
we haven't done that work, but my hypothesis would be that you'd see modulation in fMRI signal as a function of that.
As a function of culture.
Yeah, yeah.
Didn't mean to hate you.
No. It's just reminding me of when I moved back. So I grew up in the Bay Area, but was in New Jersey for 22 years, and I was just having this flashback to the first winter I was there and having to step over homeless people to get in the subway. And in the beginning thinking, oh, well, I can't do that. That's inhumane. I can't do that. And
eventually, kind of
great question. I don't know if Harris or Fisk have done that, but that I would Google them. Okay. We've looked at 3 reasons why there might be something different about the actions of other people compared to the movements of objects. Motor experience, visual experience, and social emotional processes. So motor experience. I can move like another person moves, but no matter how hard I try, I can't move like a Chevy. Or I don't ever want to fall out of a tree like a fluttering leaf, or crash like a wave. So my motor system knows something about what it sees when it sees other people move that it doesn't know about crashing waves and falling leaves. So is there something about, does a motor system work with the visual system when you're looking at other people move? And many of you in this room will say, yeah. Visual experience is another one. Back in the old days, before perception-action coupling was accepted, at least in vision conferences, whenever I found evidence of motor experience, they'd say, "Oh, Maggie, get over yourself. It's visual experience." And you'll see that there are effects for the fact that we spend our lives looking at other people moving. If you look around this room, the only thing that's moving is other people, right? We pay a lot of attention to other people. You've probably spent a lot of time in this room and spent a lot of time looking at the color of paint on this wall, but I'm guessing it hasn't had much of an impact on your life. But the actions of the other people in the room probably have. And that is because of social processes, right? Human action carries all this social information that the motion of a fluttering leaf doesn't carry. So let's look at these one by one and try to figure out if these things do impact our perception of other people. So the first study that we did a while ago, and this is PET research done with Jean de Setti when he was still in Lyon. was to look at the question, just first of all, when you look at somebody else, is your motor system active? You're not moving, you're not acting, you're just passively observing. So coming up, you'll see this again and again in my work, how hard we have to work to find appropriate control conditions, because it's tough to compare the visual perception of a person in a rock or a person in a car, and some of you in this room are struggling with that right now. So the way we've tried to do it is by making things either possible or impossible, or doing all sorts of crafty things. So one of the things we did was to take that apparent motion display that I showed you before and take advantage of the fact that if we present the pictures in rapid succession, you see something impossible, right? You see the shortest path of motion. But if we take the same images and present them more slowly, then you see human movement. So the question is, is your motor system active when you perceive something that you can do, possible human movement, but not when you see something that you can't do, impossible human movement? And that's actually what we found. Not exactly in the way we expected it, but that's what we found. When you see an action that you can perform, so an arm going this way, what we found in our subjects was activation of the primary motor cortex. When we presented exactly the same pictures more rapidly, we didn't get motor system activation, primary or otherwise. And when we presented objects, we didn't get primary motor cortex activation either. So it's a start. It tells you, okay, the motor system's active, but you might say, well, who cares? Is it actually contributing to perception? Is it, just because it's active doesn't mean anything. Maybe our subjects were, I don't know, looking at these actions and thinking about, I don't know, going to the gym later or something. What's it actually mean? Does it actually impact anything? So, what we did is to look at, if I'm using my motor system to interpret your actions, then then I should be able to create a problem. And that is, if I'm using my motor system to perform this action, then I should have trouble interpreting you performing the same action. And the more similar our actions, the more interference, the more hit there should be to perceptual processes. So to get at that, we used an old technique, a point light walker, which is kind of a trippy thing, right? You take a whole human body and you reduce it down to a few points, and you can detect a lot of information from that few points of motion. You can tell that it's a person, you can tell what they're doing, depending on their action, you can tell their gender, their emotional state, a little bit about their intentionality. It's amazing how much a few points of light can carry. So what we did is basically an old-fashioned speed discrimination task. This time it was gait speed. So we'd show people up there in these little screens on a monitor, 2 point light walkers, one after the other. And the walking speed of the point light walkers always varied by ½ kilometer per hour. And we systematically changed the gait so that you couldn't just use the step size or the rapidity of the steps to do the judgment. So you're looking at 2 of these point light walkers, and you just have to say which one's walking faster. Okay, 2 alternative force choice tasks. And what varies across conditions is that the subjects are either standing still, they're walking on a treadmill while they're watching walking motion, or they're riding a bicycle. And accuracy, just in terms of percent correct in this 2 alternative force choice task, is shown here. This is the speed of the walking. The downward slope is not anything interesting. We always had a fixed difference of ½ kilometer per hour, and ½ kilometer is a big difference here, so the task is easy, and it's a small difference here, so the task is harder. The thing that's interesting is that the standing subject and the subject riding the bicycle consistently performed this gait speed discrimination task more accurately than the walking observer. Right? That's kind of trippy. It suggests that if I'm using my motor system to walk, then I'm less sensitive to your walking motion, which suggests that, okay, the visual system, the motor system is really doing something with the visual system.
Was the rate of walking controlled?
Yes, we did this across a number of studies so that the subject's gait was always the same as one of the walkers. And different from the other walker by half a kilometer. Okay. This is a funny study. I don't know how we ever got it published. But let me tell you about it. There were 2 key subjects in this study. They gave different answers, and yet somehow we were able to make a story. But it was a cool idea. This we did with Peter Brugger in Zurich, Switzerland. And the question is, all right, what do we mean by a body and what do we mean by an object? If I've never had hands, what are hands? Are they part of a body or are they an object? That was where we started from. Now, Peter's done he's an amazing guy, he's done amazing research, looking at all sorts of things, near-death experiences, and I think he's probably best known for his work that he's done on people without limbs to look at their body representation. So when I was a kid and, I don't know, maybe a generation or 2 younger, there was a medication that they gave pregnant women to deal with morning sickness. It was called thalidomide. And it led to a birth defect, which is being born without limbs. So there's a generation of people who don't have limbs, and Peter involved these folks in his research to try to understand how the human body is represented internally. And he's found some amazing things, and you'll see some of his really interesting findings in this. So the question is, let's take people who have never had hands and see what do they do, how do they perceive hand motion? Do they perceive it as bits of the body or do they perceive it as objects? So instead of doing this, whole arm sort of business with various displays, do the same thing with arm rotations and various flipping motions. I can't remember what they all were now. But it's the same apparent motion sort of display. You'd see this, and then you'd see this, and you'd have to say, okay, was the path of motion this long path or this short sort of path that objects take? And we varied the timing between the displays. So down here is the timing again. This is really, really slow. This is relatively fast. This is the percentage of time that people saw the impossible path, the object-like path, if you will, and this is the percentage of time subjects reported seeing this long, physically possible path. The red line are 6 physically intact control subjects, and they do just what they did before. They'd see the short, physically impossible paths of motion when we show the pictures really rapidly, and then the possible paths of motion as we show them more slowly. 2 subjects without arms, AZ and CL. AZ is somebody who Peter Brugger has studied quite a bit because while her left arm stops about here and her right arm stops above the elbow, so she has no hands, no wrists, no forearms, no elbows. She nonetheless has an internal representation of those limbs, which really, part of what Peter's been working on is looking at the multimodal aspects of body representations. And the idea that he's been looking at is at a low level in the motor system, do we represent ourselves physically in part as a function of belonging to the human race and seeing other people like us? Anyway, that's how he interprets AZs. So when AZ did this task, she got her responses were the same as people with hands. But when CL, who's a journalist, did the same task, what he got was consistently reported seeing the same shortest path across all the ISIs, as if he were looking at an object. It's kind of trippy. So it may be that for us, a human body is whatever matches the outline of our own body schema. That's the story. And we got it published. Let's stop there. Okay. So that was, what if you've never had a limb? But how about if you've got all your limbs, but there's certain things that you can't do? I love watching ice skating. Now, I can barely stand up on ice skates, but what fascinates me is when I watch ice skating, is the commentary. Tara Lipinski and all these, and somebody will skate around and they'll twirl and it just, oh, get so excited. Did you see them land that triple Lutz? They spun 3 times? I can't, I've spent days of my life staring at ice skaters, trying to see the triple. I can't see it. They'll slow it down and then I can. But whether, how the ankle lands, I can't, it just amazes me. And that's the sort of phenomenon that we were trying to get at here. This is out of Elizabeth Lavadas's lab in Bologna. Notice I only work with people who live in interesting places. Okay, so what Elizabeth was looking at was she had a very large population of people who had a stroke and so were hemiplegic. They couldn't move their right arm or their left arm as a result of a stroke. Okay? And she brought them into her lab and made those point light displays out of actions and gestures performed by their good arm, either their right arm or their left arm. Right? So this was Italy, so there was all gestures like this and a lot of this. She created 10 different gestures, and then with only the good arm, right? Because the other arm was no longer functional. And then the manipulation was so simple. We just took those videos, duplicated them, and flipped them. So half the time you were looking at an action that mapped exactly onto your body. So if you had made the gestures with the right hand, you were seeing a point light display of somebody making the gestures with their right hand. The other half of the time you're seeing exactly the same motion, mirror reverse. So it appears as if you can do the gesture with your compromised limb. Okay. And then it was just a very crude task. People looked at the gestures and had to report what the action was. We also had controls who were typically limbed folks who we picked one arm at random and said do the same gestures, and then they saw either that same action, well, half the time they saw that same action and half the time they saw the mirror reversed version. And in controls it made no difference whatsoever. But in the hemiplegic patients, there was a significant, small but significant drop in sensitivity as a function of whether you were looking at exactly the same action that you performed or the mirror reversed version of it. Crazy, right? But it turns out that if you're looking at something that's aligned with your body, it matters. Which is, we took that as pretty strong evidence, and Martin Serino, who did a lot of this work, did just these beautiful analyses and follow-up brain imaging to look at the extents of the damage from the stroke. It was, for me, it was a pretty compelling argument that your current ability to do something influences how you perceive other people's actions. The control study was with point light animals. We didn't show a difference there. Kind of tricky. So that's an example of the studies that we've done, looking at whether, essentially what's now called perception-action coupling, looking at, is it possible that what differentiates our perception of people and objects is the fact that our motor system can contribute to our perception of other people, but can't contribute to, or at least not in the same way, contribute to our perception of objects. Cool. You buy it. I love it. Okay. Visual experience. Yeah, please.
Sorry. So do you think that might relate to sort of people that have either played sports or still play sports being more interested in the sports that they've engaged in?
Absolutely, absolutely. Natalie Sabance, when she was a postdoc in my lab, did a nice study on deception, looking at basketball players, watching other basketball players either attempt to pass the basketball or fake a pass. And that was your task. Is this person really going to throw the ball, or is it a fake? And folks who had spent a lot of time playing basketball were much better at that than novices. Not the strongest study in the world, because in that case, motor experience and visual experience are the same. There's a group in Italy that's done a much nicer version of this. I can't believe I'm blanking on the first author's name. With basketball players, looking at, they did both psychophysics and where's Ramesh? They recorded MEPs. MEPs. It's a great study with semi-professional basketball players, novices, and sports journalists and coaches. So people who had a lot of experience watching people do these actions that they actually can't perform. And I never remember the results right because they don't agree with my hypothesis. It turned out to be more complicated than I thought it would be, but it's beautiful. Yeah, it matters. It matters. And you can push it even further. I mean, I grew up with a father who was a football player, so every Sunday we were there watching football, and the level of engagement it's not just visual. I mean, it's really embodied. Sometimes I thought he must have been exhausted after some of those games.
So, really quickly,
Yeah.
so then don't you think it's kind of puzzling that in your first experiment, when people are walking on the treadmill,
Yeah.
they have trouble in the walking condition and not when they're still? Because, I mean, it's just such a natural task,
Yes,
right?
I hate that result.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Wolfgang Prince and Kathy Reed have been going back and forth using a completely different paradigm with the same problem. Sometimes when you're doing the same thing that you're seeing, you get facilitation, and sometimes you get inhibition. And you'd have to ask them why it's one way or another. I don't find either all that. Yeah.
Do you think it could have anything to do with how familiar people are with seeing their own movements in a mirror image?
Ooh, that's so good. Hang on to that.
I just had a question about fatigue. Would fatigue play a role in that?
Yeah. So we had folks do speed discrimination tasks. While the nice thing about having people walk on a treadmill while they're doing the task is you can increase the incline of the treadmill and really exhaust them. And it turns out the amount of effort that I'm expending at any point in time changes my perception of other people too.
What does it change to?
We assessed gaits. It makes the more effort I'm putting, let's see, what was the study? Oh my God, I'm getting so senile. We had point light walkers that are walking at a particular speed, and we set the treadmill to different speeds. They were either the same as or faster or slower than the point light walker walking next to you. And the more effort you're expending when you walk, I actually don't know if it's the faster you think you're going or the more effort, the faster you think you're going or the slower you think the other guy's going. Yeah. But motor effort is definitely involved in this. Okay, visual experience. I cut out, because I knew there would be a lot of graduate students here, I cut out the series of studies that I forced a graduate student to do for 2 years because I wouldn't believe the results of her studies. It was terrible. It was horrible. She did study after study after study, and we could not find evidence that visual experience change influenced visual sensitivity to human movement. And what Elisa Jacobs did was to look at actions that we see frequently occurring types of gaits, and compared them to sort of weird, not exactly Monty Python Ministry of Silly Walks, weird but unusual gaits. And we just couldn't, it had to be that in my mind, and only in my mind, because it wasn't this way in the lab, it just had to be that the gaits that you saw more of that I expected greater sensitivity to. We never did find that, and then one day a Gibson book fell on my head and said, you big dummy, try to come up with something, a task that actually has some relevance to the real world. So what we did is we looked at your ability to detect somebody's identity as a function of whether they were walking in a way that you had seen them walk a lot or an unusual way. We got it. So you can get evidence for visual experience, but instead of showing you those studies, I'm going to tease Spivey and Teeny and look at the question of which one's more powerful, motor experience or visual experience. So let's imagine that we're doing a study with one subject and it's just Teeny. Teeny has a lifetime of experience in her own body, right? So she's got a lifetime of experience, motor experience with her own actions. She's been working with Spivey a long time, so she's seeing him, so she's got a lot of motor experience with his actions. And I could be wrong here, but I'm guessing you don't spend a lot of time watching Honey Boo Boo on TV. So I'm just, that's correct. So I'm guessing she doesn't have a lot of visual or motor experience looking at Honey Boo Boo's actions. So the question here is, what's she going to be more sensitive to? The actions that she's seen a lot or the actions that she's performed a lot relative to Honey Boo Boo? What my students did was to, without people knowing, recruit them in sort of triplets. So everybody was recruited with actually a same gender, same size friend, and a same gender, same size, same age stranger. And they did a very unusual sort of task. First, you'd see a point light display of someone doing something. Then you'd see another movie of someone doing something else. And your task was that the same person or two different people? Hard, right? It was a very tricky task. And what we found in this, what we called an identity discrimination task, is that people, so it's two alternative force choices, right? So chance is 50%. People were best at the task when they were looking at their own actions. They were at chance when they were seeing strangers, and they were above chance with a friend, but not as high. So we take this as evidence that people, that motor experience is more important than visual experience. Now, you take this to a vision conference and they swear you think vision is king, and come on, Maggie, get over yourself. You have a lifetime of experience watching your own actions. Sure, it's not from the third person, but every time I walk upstairs, I see myself. So I'm not convinced. What I think this is visual plus motor, and this is just visual. Yeah.
How long was it after they had been recorded that they were then watching?
It was a couple of months, and we lied to them when we recorded their actions. We told them, we had them, with each of the subjects, it's a really long study, with each of the subjects we made a library of a lot of different actions, and we told them that we were creating a library where we were going to study the ability of subjects to determine what action was being performed. So we worked really hard to make people as comfortable as possible doing this, and not self-sufficient, aware. Okay. So maybe it's all visual, took us to, let's do this study again, but this time videotape people from the back. Because I've got, I've never seen myself walking or dancing from the back, but I've got all this, my motor system shouldn't care. So let's see what happens then. So we did the task again, this time just pairing subjects with strangers. And what we found is that actually people were better at doing the task, identifying themselves when they saw themselves from the back than from the front. And we think that has to do with alignment. So my right arm is on your left side right now, but if you're looking at me from the back, we align. So we suspect that's the reason, but we don't really know. But anyway, so the question of, I see myself in the mirror a lot, this is our response. Yeah, but it still looks like the motor wins out. Yes?
Do you think the effect would go away if you reversed the image from the rear?
I don't know.
I can tell you informally, we tried to replicate it, and actually, yes. I mean, the effect still stays. So there seems to be a primacy of seeing the self, no matter what the orientation is. We even had people tilt the orientation, looking from the side, etc.
The one orientation we tried where it just fell apart completely is we put the cameras up on the head and have them shoot it looking straight down, because that's where you've got all the visual experience. And the problem there is that when you've got a sagittal view, everybody's at all the points are not exactly on the same depth plane, but they're very similar. When the view is from the head straight down, I mean, my feet are not the same depth plane at all, but when you show it in 2D, it doesn't even look like a person, it's just mush. So it doesn't work from that perspective, but we never created 3D point light walkers, and that would be what you'd have to do to really get at that question. Yes, please.
So it seems like a lot of these stimulus sort of play out over time.
Mhm.
And I'm curious whether or not you've looked at how long it takes for somebody to recognize themselves, or how short of a clip you could show them and still have them identify or something like that.
No, we haven't, and I bet it would take some time. I have to, being, I guess, inherently American and thus inherently puritanical, there was an effect that I never noticed until Elizabeth came to the lab and said, well, so I was a subject in some of the preliminary studies, and part of it involved dancing and these weird movements. And what I never noticed until she pointed it out is when I was seeing videos of myself as a point light display doing actions that looked kind of dorky, I felt embarrassed before I knew it was me. And I don't know how to study that, but I guarantee you it's real. Somehow the emotionality comes first. Okay, social processes. One of the things that's different about human actions is they carry a lot of social information. And so we've peeled at that onion in a number of different ways. The first way depends on that image up there, which comes from Emily Grossman's lab. A lot of people now have localized some brain areas involved in the perception of human movement, and one of them is the superior temporal sulcus. And one of the things that's really neat about that particular area is the major input and the major output of the superior temporal sulcus is the amygdala. So that raises a question, could it be that the emotion, and the amygdala, people argue a lot about what the amygdala do, but they're involved in emotion. Some people say that they are really set up to do threat detection. Other people argue that the amygdala process all sorts of different emotions. We're going to go with a simpler, they do a lot of threat detection version. So the question is, if the activity in the amygdala is contributing to your ability to detect the presence of another person, then maybe threatening actions should be more recognizable. So what we did is we had a nice motion capture system by this point, and we had folks walk through the motion capture system and just express various emotions. And yeah, they were sort of these clowny exaggerations of emotions. That's true. They were in no way subtle. And then we normed them for recognizability. So you had, sad, sort of, and then angry and happy point light walkers. And then what we want to see is how sensitive are you to the presence of these various people as a function of the emotions that those people are expressing. So what we did is sort of a standard process for studying visual sensitivity to these point light displays is you take them and you either leave them alone so they display coherent human movement, or you juggle around the starting locations of the point so that, oh no, it stopped. Oh, they both did. Well, hopefully this moved at some point. Okay, yeah. Thank you. So that it's exactly the same motion at a point-by-point level, but they don't make a person, right? Because that might be your head and that might be your knee. And then what you can do is place those point light walkers in a cloud of similarly moving points. This is kind of an important slide for vision people because it's important for me to make the point here that the stimuli always appeared in a mask that was constructed from that same stimulus. So the analogy is, I'm not taking points from a sad, slow-moving mask and putting an angry person in it. What instead I'm doing is I'm putting angry people in angry people masks, and happy people in happy people masks, and sad people in sad people masks. So here's an unmasked display, and here is the same walker in the mask that was made from that display. So you can get a kind of a sense that it's all kind of just neutral motion. Now in the study, they weren't colored differently. It was exactly the same color, and you got to figure out, is there a person in that mask or not, which is a lot tougher when you see it this way. So on the left, there's a person in the mask. This is an angry person in a mask. This is the same energy at a point by point, but there's no person in the mask because we've scrambled the starting place. So the idea here was your ability, our subjects in this study, they just said, is there a person there or not? They never made a judgment about emotion. We never talked about emotion. And the thought was, if our ability to detect the presence of a person is independent of the emotion that that person expresses, then we'd expect data that looked something like this, where it was flat across, right. But what we found is that subjects were most sensitive to the presence of angry people, which is consistent with the story that there's something about emotional processes that's changing our perception of human action. So we do think social processes contribute to our analyses of human movement and differentiate our analyses of human movement from object movement. But then there's this final question about, okay, but what's it all about, Alfie? I mean, who cares? So that got us into working with people with autism. Now, autism is understood by the American Psychiatric Association as being a fundamentally social deficit. We have absolutely typical IQ, superior, all sorts of superior processes at a lot of levels of the visual system, but the ability to interact comfortably with other people is compromised. So the question is, do people with autism show a selective deficit in their ability to detect other people's actions? That's the question. And this is consistent with social brain theories, which have gained a lot of traction in the last decade, where the argument is the whole point of having a brain is to allow you to be a social person, and that socially relevant information is actually prioritized by our brain. So what we did is that same is there a person in the cloud or not task with a person and with a toy tractor as a control. So we brought folks into the lab that either did or didn't have, were not on the autism spectrum. These are all very high functioning people. They were undergraduates from Rutgers University with high functioning autism. The control would be these goofy sort of tractors. And if they look, if even the coherent tractor looks odd to you, there's a reason for that. And I'll show it to you in a second. So we're playing the same game. You look at these lumps of points and you just say, is there a person in there, yes or no? So it's just a yes-no trial. There's a block of human trials, a couple blocks of human trials, a couple blocks of tractor trials, yes or no, tractor, not tractor. And we're using we're looking at adults, essentially. And what you find, so this is sensitivity. The higher number means greater sensitivity, more accuracy in performing the task. Typical observers with autism spectrum disorder. And in typical observers, what you find is greater sensitivity to human movement than to object movement, which is consistent with these social brain theories. Interestingly, what you find with observers with autism is equal sensitivity to objects and people. It's as if their visual systems are not prioritizing the actions of other people. And that would make a lot of sense. You could imagine how stressful the world would be if your ability to determine whether somebody was reaching out to shake your hand or punch you in the nose was compromised. We did not, in the previous study, we did not match for IQ, and some reviewers raised questions about that. So instead of matching IQ, we went backwards and ran people who were much younger in the same task. We went to a really neat summer school at Jim Tanaka, and again, another beautiful place, the University of Victoria in British Columbia, and had them do the same, is there a person in the mask, is there a tractor in the mask, with children ranging in age from 6 to 12. These are typical kids, and at every age group, you can see that visual sensitivity to human movement is greater than visual sensitivity to tractor movement. So we don't think it's a function of IQ. Okay. Now, I've been saying people with autism as if that constitutes somehow a separate category in humanity, and it certainly doesn't. All of us have more or less autistic traits, and there's a way to measure that. It was created by this guy, Simon Baron-Cohen, who created, I blew my punchline, you'll see in a second, who created the autism quotient, which measures the extent of autistic traits in typical observers. And you won't be surprised by the punchline. University professors have more autistic traits than folks who aren't in university. Mathematicians and scientists have more autistic traits than folks in the humanities. Men more so than women. And my punchline went like this before I blew it. This guy's cousin is Borat. Truthfully. Sacha Baron Cohen, if you haven't seen the Borat movies, you might know him as the mankini model, but no, well, that was still, never mind. So the autism quotient, the AQ, it's a very simple questionnaire with questions like, I find social situations easy, I tend to notice details, others don't. I'd rather go to a library than a party. I mean, right, it's describing us, right? This is what faculty are like. So what's interesting is folks with autism score high on the autism quotient, but typical folks also show a skewed normal distribution. There are, this is probably where a bunch of us are. Right? So the question is, does our visual sensitivity to other people's actions vary with our AQ? Typical observers, we gave them the same tractor human task and had them complete the autism quotient questionnaire. This is performance on the task. Bigger number means bigger performance. This is a Q score, so this would be fewer autistic traits. This would be more autistic traits. And what we found, I'm trying the linear regression lines on there because the data are all over the place, but nonetheless, there is a significant relationship between AQ score and visual sensitivity to human movement. And we didn't get a significant correlation between AQ and tractor movement. So we do think that there is a meaningful relationship between social behavior, social abilities, and visual sensitivity to human movement. There's a bunch of control studies mentioned here that I didn't present. What we don't know, and this is really key, is the directionality of this effect. Is it that living with autism, as a reason that visual sensitivity to other people's actions drop as a function of living with autism, or is compromised visual sensitivity to other people's actions part of what gives rise to autistic traits? And obviously that would be a very fundamental question to tangle apart for treatment. Okay, so general conclusions. The work of my colleagues and I suggest that the visual sensitivity of human movement does differ from visual analysis of objects and non-human movement. And we think that this differentiation is a function of at least three things: motor experience, visual experience, and social processes. And that at least some of the individual differences in visual sensitivity to human movement can be understood in a systematic way. And that's it. Thank you very much.